A warm welcome, everyone participating in this webinar. My name is Willemijn Keizer, and I am the Executive Director of the Netherland-America Foundation. The Netherland-America Foundation organizes webinars and lectures on business, cultural, and historical topics of importance to Dutch-American relations. Today's webinar, Dutch Slave Resistance in New York, is very special to us for a multitude of reasons. Among others, it is the NAF's first transatlantic partnership with the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in Middelburg, the Netherlands. So thank you, RIAS, for partnering with us. And thank you to all our panelists today for sharing your research and insights on this important topic with us. The Netherland-America Foundation is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And our mission is to strengthen the bonds between the US and the Netherlands. To accomplish this, we fund educational exchanges for Dutch and American students and scholars. We sponsor cultural exchanges and foster business ties. To make this possible, please consider becoming a member. If you'd like to learn more about the NAF, you can visit us at www.naf.org. Our next webinar, Differences in Diversity, will be on Tuesday, June 9th at noon. And on Sunday, June 27th, we're organizing a virtual concert, Music in the Time of COVID-19, featuring NAF alums Alicia Silberstein on violin and Xin Wang on harpsichords. You can sign up for these events on our website on the events tab. We hope that you'll enjoy this webinar and join us for future NAF events. Thank you all so much. Damien, over to you.
Thank you very much, Willemijn. I would like to take this opportunity to welcome our distinguished panel, as well as our guests from the Netherlands and the United States. My name is Damien Pargas, and I'm the director of the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies in Middelburg, the Netherlands. The RIAS is a research center and a graduate school that is formally affiliated with Leiden University, where I'm also a professor of North American history. I'm very excited about this webinar today, partly because it's a wonderful opportunity to host a live transatlantic event on a topic of such importance to both our communities, but more selfishly because this is a topic that I'm dying to know more about. So let me say a little bit about how we came up with the theme for today. I'm a historian of American slavery, and like most slavery scholars, I've always been primarily focused on the southern states. And recently I was poking around the office in Middelburg and I discovered a Dutch Roosevelt family Bible from early New York. This was a gift from the Roosevelt family to the Institute back in the 80s. And I noticed that it had belonged to none other than Johannes Roosevelt, John Roosevelt, who lived in New York from 1689 to 1750. Now, I think most scholars know John Roosevelt as the progenitor of the Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor Roosevelt side of the Roosevelt family. He was also the son of the original Roosevelt emigrants to New Netherland back in the 17th century from Zeeland province. Slavery historians, however, know Johannes Roosevelt primarily as the owner of Quack, the enslaved man who was accused of instigating the 1741 slave rebellion, during which Fort George and much of New York was burned to the ground. Holding this Dutch family Bible in my hands that Quack must have passed by every day living in that household got me thinking for the first time really about the experiences of enslaved people like Quack, owned by Dutch families in New York, and in particular their role in acts of resistance in the history of New York slavery, not just trying to burn down New York City, but also running away and even their involvement in abolitionism like Sojourner Truth. So when Willemijn and I were brainstorming about a topic for this webinar, we thought it would be really interesting to bring together some of the best minds working on this theme. Michael Dauma from Georgetown University, Andrea Mosterman from the University of New Orleans, and Margaret Washington from Cornell University, and to have a public discussion about it, a transatlantic discussion. So without further ado, I'll introduce our moderator of that discussion, Russell Shorto. Russell is a renowned American author, journalist, historian, and senior scholar at the New Netherland Institute. He's the author of several books and a regular contributor to the New York Times Magazine. He's most famous over here in the Netherlands, I can tell you, for his excellent book on the Dutch origins of New York City, called The Island at the Center of the World, about New Amsterdam. Russell was also director of the John Adams Institute here in Amsterdam from 2008 to 2013. And in 2009, he was knighted into the Order of Oranje Nassau for his strengthening of Dutch-US relations. Russell and you prefer not to be called Sir Russell, but officially I think we should. Russell, thank you so much for participating today, and I will give the floor to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Damien. That was an overly generous introduction, but I'll live with it. So thank you to the Netherland-America Foundation and the Roosevelt Institute for American Studies for hosting this event. Thank you to Professors Margaret Washington, Michael Dauma, and Andrea Mosterman for participating. We have a lot of ground to cover, so I would like to jump right in. And first, let me quickly ask each of you to give us, in 1 minute or less, what you would like to talk about today, what you would like our audience to focus on. Margaret Washington, how about if I begin with you? What will you be talking about in a few minutes?
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me, and I have to begin by saying that Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Cayuga Nation, members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. And the Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell, the colony of New Netherlands, the province and state of New York, and the United States of America. And so we want to acknowledge the painful history of the Haudenosaunee dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Haudenosaunee, past and present, on these lands and waters. Having said that, and that's not unrelated to the New Netherlands, because the African presence in New Netherlands was very important from an indigenous perspective as well. There was a lot of interaction between Africans and indigenous people. But primarily my research as far as Dutch history is concerned focuses on Sojourner Truth, who was an African Dutch woman who lived in Ulster County, born and raised in Ulster County, about 50 miles north of New York. When I wrote the book, I realized how important Dutch culture was to Sojourner. And so I had an entire section of the book on Dutch culture and the ambiance of Sojourner Truth. So for my comments, I would hope that we could spend some time focusing on African Dutch culture, not so much from my perspective as resistance in terms of rebellions and runaways, but challenges to slavery nonetheless. And I think that Sojourner Isabella, as she was her birth name, personifies that, not only in terms of flight, because she did take her own freedom, but accountability, custom, treatment that in a way sort of distinguishes to some extent Dutch slavery from English slavery, because I was trained as a Southern historian. And so I came at New York history and New York slavery from the perspective of the South. And so I made some, I think, very interesting comparisons. So those are the kinds of perimeters that I'm comfortable talking about and answering questions about.
Okay, thanks for that. Michael Dauma?
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone. For the past 3 years, I've been writing about Dutch slavery in New York, taking a sort of a total approach, looking at everything. And what it's narrowed down to for me, where my contributions can be, is in economics. And so I've been writing a book, which is, I don't know, maybe 80% complete, about the economics of slavery in Dutch New York after New Netherlands, so after 1664. Today, I'll be presenting one chapter of that book that I'm working on. And this is a chapter which is a quantitative analysis of runaway slave records. So essentially, I have looked extremely hard to find every newspaper mention of a runaway slave from 1730 to 1825. I have 385 of them now, and I'm able to analyze these and tell us something about what's going on in New York based on these numbers.
Thank you. Andrea Mosterman.
Thanks, Russell.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you so much for having me. It's really great to be participating in this, and I'm glad that there's more and more attention to the history of enslaved people in Dutch New York. I have just finished a book on slavery in the Dutch communities in early New York, and much of what I'll be talking about today relates to the research that I've done for that. I looked at the ways in which Dutch enslavers in early New York really contained and controlled or tried to control enslaved people in these areas, in these communities, and how enslaved people in New York responded to that. And really looking at it through the whole period of slavery, which was 200 years in New York, which is quite significant. It's longer than Georgia had slavery. And so it's a long period of slavery. And of course, a lot of things change over the course of that period. And that is one of the things that I've actually looked at, and how slavery in New York changes, how the enslavement of people changes in New York, and how enslaved people respond to that, and use the various ways that they can to achieve freedom or obtain freedom, or at least improve their circumstances or the circumstances for their children and loved ones as best as they can. So that's what I'd love to talk about.
Okay, thanks for that quick overview. Now we have a sense of, okay, we're going to zoom in on, there's one person, and I'm sure the most famous person associated with Dutch slavery, and that's Sojourner Truth. And then we're going to come at it quantitatively, and then Andrea is going to kind of do the byways of slavery and slave resistance in New York. Let's now maybe if we come at this in reverse order and begin with Andrea, because her research, at least as I understand it, starts chronologically. Earlier than Michael's and Margaret's. And before I pose a question to you, Andrea, let me, as I introduce each of you, I should give a little bit more of an introduction. Andrea Mosterman is Associate Professor in Atlantic History and Joseph Tragle Professor in Early American History at the University of New Orleans. In her work, she explores the multifaceted dimensions of slavery, the slave trade, and cross-cultural contact in the Dutch Atlantic and early America, with a special emphasis on New York. Her forthcoming book, Spaces of Enslavement, A History of Slavery and Resistance in Dutch New York, will come out this fall, and it won the 2020 Hendricks Award for Best Book-Length Manuscript related to New Netherland and the Dutch colonial experience. Andrea, this is all about slavery within Dutch context in New York. Can you set that Dutch context? What was New Netherland for those who don't really have any sense of that? And then give us the extent of slavery and what slavery was in the Dutch colony.
Yeah, of course. So New Netherland, of course, is the Dutch colony that really, it's a large region. Today it would be New York, New Jersey, parts of Connecticut and Pennsylvania even. So it's a large area that the Dutch claimed. Of course, they were only found in just a few parts of it, predominantly in what is Manhattan and the surrounding areas, Long Island, Staten Island, like that particular part of New York. And then Albany was an important early settlement, Beverwijk, and those areas, the Dutch had various settlements. And then in between along the Hudson River, they had an important settlement. There were some other places as well. So actually Nieuwe Amstel, which is in what today is Delaware, for a period, the Dutch also had extended New Netherland into that area. So, but that's the broader region. And it's in the 1620s that the West India Company for the first time actually brings people to the colony. And these are families, European families that are settling in the area. And it's really not that long after that enslaved Africans are being brought to the colony. And we don't know we don't know the exact year, but it's likely to have been around 1627. So some suspect it maybe have been 26, others think it may have been 28. It's around that time that we see the first enslaved Africans in the colony. And most of the enslaved Africans in the area lived in Manhattan and the surrounding areas. There are fewer living also in the Beverwijk area, so really in the Albany, New York region. And in the latter part of the 17th century, there's evidence that we see them also in what today is Kingston, New York. And in Nieuwer-Amstel, they actually have an effort to bring enslaved Africans there, and that's part of the ship, the Gideon, which arrives in New York, or which is then still New Amsterdam, the main colonial town on the southernmost point of Manhattan, that brings 290 enslaved people to the colony, and a fourth of those are supposed to go to the Nieuwer-Amstel colony. So we see enslaved Africans, and as Dr. Washington is pointing out, also enslaved indigenous people across the colony during the Dutch colonial period. There's less evidence of indigenous people who were enslaved in the Dutch colonies, the Dutch communities, although they were there. Over the course of the 18th century, it's clear from the records that there were many indigenous people who were enslaved in early New York. So it's important to also acknowledge that. But most of them would have been living in New Amsterdam and in the colonial town of New Amsterdam.
Okay, let me ask you to now quickly, if you could give us a sense of what slavery was at that time in New Netherland in the 17th century, because I think for a lot of us, maybe nearly all of us, we have an image. If we think of slavery in America, you know, it's, as people have said, it's the South, it's plantation, it's one thing, but in New Netherland, it was something quite else.
Yeah, it was. And actually, I think this is important, that the work of Ira Berlin is very important here. He has shown how across the Americas and then across the North American colonies, slavery evolves and changes over time. So what we see in New Netherland in the 17th century is actually very similar to circumstances that we see, for example, in Virginia in the 17th century. And that is that there's no legislation yet in New Netherland that regulates slavery, that codifies slavery into law. There's no slave codes of any sort. And that changes by the latter part of the 17th century. So of course, the English initially take over the colony in 1664. There's some back and forth, and by the 1670s, it's permanently an English colony. It's in the latter part of the 17th century that we see slavery changing. Now, I really want to make sure that it's clear that this is not because, I don't think that this is because it's become an English colony. It's changes that we actually see already during the Dutch colonial period, but really become more prominent by the latter part of the 17th century, and we see it across the colonies. So during the Dutch colonial period, we don't see any regulation of enslaved people, which means that enslaved Africans have access to the courts. And again, it's not because there's any laws that say that they should be allowed to the courts, it's that there's an absence of any regulations that they cannot use the courts. So they use the Dutch court system. They use they attend the Dutch Reformed Church. Many of them are able to actually obtain their freedom and own property in Manhattan. And so when we think about slave resistance in early New York, when we look at this early period, much of it is really working within the system, as some scholars have used this language. Linda Rupert and of course, Jane Landers have used that terminology of working within the system, as in enslaved people in certain circumstances can resist their bondage or try to obtain more autonomy within their circumstances by using the system to their advantage. And so during the Dutch colonial system, that could be like the lack of regulation, the lack of restrictions. There was nothing that kept them from doing certain things. And so we see enslaved Africans going to the court and actually claiming to not have received certain wages and win cases against Dutch settlers, Dutch white settlers. Sometimes they claim that their property was damaged by free white settlers, and cases are won. So, or they win these cases. So we see that lack of regulation and restrictions allows them to do so. And it doesn't mean that there's not more, that there aren't any enslaved people who try to flee the colony or these Dutch communities, but we do see that a lot of it is working within the system. Whereas once by the latter part of the 17th century, it becomes more regulated, and we do see clear slave codes in New York that actually really limit the movement and the activities of enslaved people. That's when we see that there's a different form of resistance, where enslaved people try to work and resist those systems to expand their autonomy and their freedoms, or to resist their bondage.
And what brings about that change? Why do things become codified? Is it numbers? You said it wasn't simply the change from the Dutch to the English. So what does bring the change about?
So we see these changes across the colonies, and even in some ways across the Americas, that there's more clearly a shift to the enslavement of Africans and African descendants, and that the system of enslavement becomes increasingly racialized with that shift, and that there's also an increased reliance on the labor of enslaved Africans. And as their labor becomes more important and their numbers are growing, so in New York, we actually see that the numbers of enslaved Africans is growing increasingly over the course of the 18th century, especially. Like the numbers we see by the latter part of the 18th century are very different from what we see at the latter part of the 17th century. And just to give you an example, when we look at percentages, and I'm going to take Kings County, which is Brooklyn, New York, which was an extreme, I will say that, that it was on the extreme end of what was happening in New York. But by 1790, in some of the townships in Brooklyn, about 40% of the population was enslaved. So again, that was an extreme. In other parts, we see that it's closer to 15 across the region, closer to 15%. But there are these pockets, and of course, Brooklyn was an especially Dutch stronghold in New York. So we also see that in that area, about 75% of the families, the Dutch families in Brooklyn, enslaved people within their homes. So the numbers definitely become more and more significant. And as this population grows, with that also comes an increased need to really restrict their movements and activities. And there's some very clear examples where enslaved people are actually trying to resist bondage, and that leads to certain codes. So for example, in 1708, there's an enslaved African woman and an enslaved indigenous man who actually kill the family that enslaves them. It's the Hallett family, and it's also Long Island and Queens. And they kill the man, the woman who's pregnant, and their children. And in response to that, they are burned at the stake. And we see that there's actually legislation that specifically says that they need to restrict the movements and activities of enslaved people more to avoid that from happening again. The same thing happens after the slave revolt in New York City in 1712. Again, in legislation in New York City itself and more regionally, we see that they are responding to that by imposing more regulation. So enslaved Africans in New York are increasingly limited in their movements. They are not allowed in many of these communities to actually gather with more than 4 people at the time. They're not allowed to go on the streets without a lantern at night. They need a pass to be able to travel, to be able to really be in public spaces. They need to prove that they have permission from their enslavers. They're no longer allowed to actually sell or buy goods unless they have permission from their enslavers. At some point, they're not even allowed to rake for oysters unless there's a white person with them. So there's more and more legislation that really limits their activities and their movements within the state or the colony of New York, and later on the state, but within the colony of New York. And there's within the cities, they have guards to actually, like watchmen, to actually patrol the streets and ensure this. We see that there's patrols, similar kind of patrols in more rural communities as well, to make sure that any enslaved people try to run away, that they are retrieved, that there's no irregular activities. So there's a lot of this like cracking down on the activities, and in large part because the numbers are growing and because the resistance is growing.
And quickly, because I want to move on to Michael and Margaret, but so therefore, what types of resistance emerge?
Yeah, so the resistance is really resisting a lot of that legislation. So we see that enslaved people, when they're not allowed to actually travel the streets at night without a lantern, or meeting with more than 4 people, or selling goods, we see that they do that still, but they do it. They travel the towns via alleyways, for example. They jump from yard to yard. A lot of them were at the back of the house, living in the back of the house, or in the kitchen. So sometimes the kitchens are used to actually meet, to gather. We see this especially in the case of Betts, Deanne, and Pompey, who set the property of Gansevoort in Albany on fire in 1793. In one of the testimonies, it's described very clearly that they use alleyways, they jump from yard to yard, they actually meet in one of the kitchens before they travel, because that's a safe space. They know when the watchmen are patrolling the streets, so they actually regulate their movement according to the times that they know they can safely do so. When it comes to passes, we see people are forging passes or extending their period by using a pass that maybe is for a day or two, and they extend that for more days than that. So there's these various ways that they respond to that by really hiding their activities when they're not allowed, or trying to extend them in ways that they can do those things that they're legally not allowed to do so.
Thank you for that. A couple of people raised hands. I just want to say that what we're trying to do is we're going to get each of the speakers in here, and then afterwards we'll allow time for questions. Michael, you're a numbers person. What do we get? I mean, I think a lot of historians are kind of afraid of numbers. When we take a quantitative study of this, first of all, why is that important?
Well, I'm not a numbers person. I just fell into it because, as an economist would say, I have, it's my comparative advantage to do it because other historians aren't. And that's something that bothered me when I started studying New York slavery. I'm like, well, how many are we talking about?
Mm-hmm.
What is this? I don't have the numbers in front of me, but in general, there's about 2,000 slaves in New York in the year 1700, and there's about 20,000 in the year 1800, and the growth is pretty linear. And I've done a ton of demographic work on this, so I can say that I know that there's probably about 75 or 76,000 slaves that lived in New York at some point in the 18th century. That is, had their foot in New York, were born there, etc. And I would say about 30, my estimate is at least 30% of those were Dutch, and that the numbers, the percent that were Dutch was pretty consistent over time, that about 30% of that population in whatever year was probably Dutch. Most people think there's a decline because they're looking at New York City, where the Dutch speaking slave population does decline, but there's a huge growth in the Hudson Valley that offsets this decline in Manhattan. So that's the first important thing to say. I have looked at runaway slave advertisements in the 18th century into the 19th century. As Andrea knows, there are runaway slaves earlier than that. It's just they're very hard to track. There's not records for these things. And so to get to Russell's point, Why is quantitative stuff so important? It's to get a hold of what we're talking about, where to look for patterns in types of things, but also to recognize that in the colonial period, this stuff is very difficult to find. So all of the databases that I've built for my book, whether it's slave prices, runaway slaves, demographic numbers, I've had to construct almost all of this myself painstakingly, and then analyze it one way or another. And this is something that other people didn't do or weren't willing to do. I guess I'm the sucker to spend the time doing this without a research assistant. So I should have. But yeah, so that's the important thing. Why quantitative stuff is important. And so, like I said before, I have 385 runaway slave ads, which mention in one way or another that the runaway slaves spoke Dutch. I've coded these for various things, male or female, age, location of the runaway, and the extent of their Dutch language abilities. Now, this is always kind of a guess, but you can infer it from the advertisement if it says that they're bilingual or not, or if they speak Dutch and English with a Dutch accent, whatever. So I've created 4 categories from monolingual Dutch to bilingual Dutch with an English accent, and then English speakers that know a little bit of Dutch. So there's 3 main takeaways from this research of mine on runaway slave ads, and the first 2 aren't particularly interesting for the theme of resistance, but the third one is about resistance. So let me get through these 3 real quick. The first thing that I can see in these 385 ads is that we have an increasing number of runaways over time. Now, this may just be a reflection of the fact that we have more newspapers, right? So you're just simply finding more advertisements, but I don't think that's the case. I think there's a real number, and perhaps even a real proportion, of slaves in New York that are running away, particularly after the American Revolution. So the revolution gets their feet hot for freedom, and it also encourages them to find other free communities that they can run away to. The other interesting thing about language here is that most of the Dutch-speaking persons who Dutch-speaking enslaved persons who run away are bilingual, and I think this is because they need English to survive as they go to New York City. But even into the year 1805, 1810, you find runaway slaves that are explicitly monolingual Dutch. And you don't find them from just one place. It's not just Brooklyn. There's villages all around the Hudson Valley, up and down the Hudson Valley, where enslaved Africans still speak only Dutch, or at least know English. They may speak other languages, African languages, Portuguese, French, etc., from that they learn elsewhere. But this just shows the extent of the Dutch language speaking zone of New York that late. Because if you have a monolingual Dutch speaker in some village, you better believe that he's surrounded by farmers who are also monolingual or close to monolingual Dutch speakers. So that's interesting. My second point with this is that runaway slave activity is very costly. It's an economic problem for the slave owners in New York, and that the numbers are very high. We know from the 1850 and 1860 census, the average rate of runaways in the American South. So they asked slave owners on their plantations, how many slaves have run away in this past year? And it's a very small percent. It's like, it's less than half of 1%. I think it's like 1/10 of 1%. In New York, it's much higher than this. And it's costly because every time a slave runs away, that's a capital loss, and it's a threat to the remaining capital. If you think of slave owners owning slaves as capital, it means that every other slave they have is more likely to run away. And it's hard to know this exactly. I'm not sure if the Dutch rates of runaway are higher than the English in New York. We can't figure that out. I can't figure that out yet. But it's certainly much higher in New York than it is in any southern state at any point in time. It's somewhere in the range of Delaware in 1860, when everyone was getting out of Delaware and fleeing in other directions. The other important thing here is that New York is surrounded by states, Pennsylvania, Vermont, Canada, places in New York City, if you're from the Hudson Valley, where you can run away to. And so there's multiple directions for runaway slaves to head out. So my third and final point here is that slave resistance is an important part of the emancipation process in New York. Now, oftentimes people like to say slavery died in New York for political reasons. And this is true. The legislature got together in 1785. They thought about it. 1798, they finally passed gradual emancipation. 1827, it ends in New York legally. But there's pressure all along from slaves. And it's the runaways who are encouraging increased amounts of negotiation. So I think Andrea is absolutely correct that there's more and more restrictions on slaves as we get into the 18th century, probably all the way up until the Revolution. But after the Revolution, slaves are negotiating and with their masters. They're running away, and this is causing the slave owners to say, well, how about instead of running away, I give you slightly better conditions, or we sign an agreement where you work for me for 10 years and then I let you go, something like this. So this is all factoring in on the legal changes that are happening in New York after the Revolution. And I think we have to credit a significant part of the death of slavery in New York to the agency of the slaves that are running away. It's not the politicians who are making the decisions on their own. The politicians are reflecting what's going on the ground. And they say, this is going to end one way or another. And making this gradual emancipation is trying to get rid of some of the struggle, perhaps the revolution that might happen on the ground. So I'll stop with that for now.
That's really interesting that this notion that the owners were feeling such pressure from the enslaved that they began to weaken the institution as a way to keep it functioning. Let me bring our third panelist in here. Margaret Washington is Marie Underhill Knoll Professor of American History at Cornell University. Her specialties are African American history and culture, African American women, and Southern history. She's one of the foremost authorities on the Black experience and the author of Sojourner Truth's America, the definitive biography. Professor Washington, can you situate Sojourner Truth for us in this context, the context of New York colonial history, New York, the state of New York, and everything that was happening against the backdrop of 19th century, mid-19th century America?
Yeah, it's very interesting. Thank you. And the comments from the other two panelists are quite revealing. I think one thing that we need to clarify is what we mean when we say New York, because there's New York City and there's rural New York. And I think that the dynamics in terms of Dutchness are different. And in the mid-Hudson Valley and beyond, which is the region that Sojourner Truth comes from, there is resistance. It's not nearly as, and Michael can correct me on this if he's got the evidence, it's not nearly as constant or continual as it is in the urban sector, or even in the area that we now know as Brooklyn, or even in New Jersey, which I think also has to be brought into this because New Jersey was Dutch as well. In rural New York, rural areas, which I'm saying Albany and beyond, but especially Ulster, which had a very large African Dutch population, there's not as much flight. And it is very heavily Dutch because, as the other panelists know, when the British took over the province of New Netherlands, they agreed that the Dutch could keep their language, and they could keep their religion. They basically were just left unencumbered. And so for the rural Dutch in Hudson Valley around Ulster County, this meant that all the way up until the 1820s, it was heavily Dutch. The Erie Canal is what really brought the change. First, the American Revolution, because some of the land was given to patriots for their services, and then the Erie Canal. Up until that time, this area was heavily Dutch, and there wasn't as much out and out flight until the Revolution. And then the Revolution created this opportunity. First of all, it meant that these African men went to areas of combat with their owners, and that created a kind of flexibility. And then 1775 on, you start seeing notices, and also in the records, Cornell has some very interesting records here of edicts from people, slaveholders, Dutch slaveholders in Ulster County, saying that there are going to be all kinds of restrictions. There's a huge attempt to burn down the city of Kingston, which becomes the capital for the Patriots. And it's an effort on the part of the African Dutch to burn Kingston, unite with the Indians, and they had already amassed powder and shot before they were, the plot was divulged. So that's in 1775. After the American Revolution, which I think speaks to Michael's point, there is even more resistance activity, so much so. But the other interesting thing about this activity after the revolution, or just before it's over, when the British are really hard pressed to win this thing, they put out, aside from the Dunmore Proclamation, which is aimed at enslaved people uniting with them, they also put out a proclamation for tenants, that is white Dutch tenants, because the land in this area is owned, the massive amount of land is owned by 2 or 3 people. One of those persons is owned by Sojourner Truth. He owns at one point 2 million acres of New York land that he bought from the Esopus Indians for $200. And he goes into partnership with another prominent Dutch patroon, Livingston. They own all this land. They basically rent it out to tenants. And so there's a large group of Dutchmen who are poor. These are the Dutch Boers. So when the freeholders get together, the leader is Sojourner Truth's, he's going to be her owner. She hasn't been born yet, but he's going to be. They get together, the freeholders, and decide they have to do something about resistance in the area. And they will not allow any tenants or any white person who is not a freeholder at any of these meetings. So resistance becomes much more broad in this rural Dutch area. And I think it's really important that the construction of resistance take in more than just race, because of the significance of tenancy in the province of New York, especially in these rural areas. And it becomes, as the early national period progresses, it becomes much more intense and even violent. And it converges with the anti-slavery movement that comes out of the first Emancipation Act, which I believe is 1799, and then finally the second one, which is 1817, but doesn't take effect until 1827. So it's like a convergence. It's not that resistance is not a factor and an important one, but I think it's a convergence of various factors that we have to take into consideration. The other one is that the social, I guess you'd say social, socio-religious aspect of it, the Quakers and the Methodists come in, and they are pushing for the end of slavery. So it's not just the politicians, it's not just people like Alexander Hamilton and people who formed the New York Manumission Society. It's these other groups that come in, as well as the resistance that the African Dutch in the rural areas are fomenting themselves. So that's one area that I look at. And then the other one for me that's really important is culture and gender. And because I'm looking at a woman, an African Dutch woman, I'm deeply interested in female culture. And that becomes a form of resistance as well. I mean, I think there's something to be said for cultural resistance, especially in the household. And there's something to be said for the difference between culture in a Dutch household and culture in an English household in terms of inclusion of the help, which in this case happens to be enslaved women, and the role of what is called pietism in Dutch culture, and I won't get into the mechanisms of Dutch pietism, but it was really something that was promoted by the women. And it becomes a way in which these African Dutch women define themselves. And it becomes a form of cultural resistance. That is to say, they're not allowed in the churches because the construction of Dutch Protestantism is such so that enslaved people don't have souls. Nonetheless, it's their responsibility to expose them to religion, to save their own souls. So the African Dutch women are embracing this and internalizing it and saying to themselves, this does indeed apply to me. And spiritual egalitarianism takes hold to a large extent. And this is one of the things that I get into in my the part one of my book on Sojourner Truth, is the role of Dutch women, the role of spiritual egalitarianism, and then also custom among the Dutch. It's different. I don't even know if it exists in British law, but in Dutch culture, enslaved people have a right to try and get another owner if they feel they are being mistreated, sometimes even going to court to get another owner. And so this creates a kind of flexibility that they use whenever it's possible. And it doesn't exist in the English speaking part of the state, the colony and the state, but it's important in the Dutch part. And because, as I mentioned earlier, the English have, through custom now, allowed the Dutch to pretty much do as they like, they continue these customs. And it creates a kind of flexibility as well. And then finally, I just want to say that there was no group more adamant about not ending slavery than the Dutch when these two manumission laws were being debated. And all the way down to the last vote, the Dutch insisted on their right to own slaves, no matter how much flexibility they might have in terms of custom, in terms of including them in household prayers and things like that, even though they had no souls. The point was they had a right to enslave them, and they never wavered in that. And that's what Sojourner fought against.
Thank you. That was a great, I mean, you really sketched a broad background there, and there was just time to suggest the relationship between that and this force that Sojourner Truth became. Let me now open it up, and I'll read some of the questions that have come in. This Cecile says, grateful to the NAF and the guests for bringing attention to the subject of African and indigenous people enslaved by the Dutch colonists. Great panel. Thank you, Professor Washington, for acknowledging the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. Here's a question. Are we talking here about a definitional issue that the enslaved Africans were really servants? Of course, I'm not debating the fact that these people were discriminated. I don't know quite what the point is there, and I don't know if anybody wants to. Andrea, go ahead.
I suspect that this is referring to the Dutch colonial period, because that comes up regularly, especially because several of these people are able to obtain their freedom. And I would argue strongly against that. Even when we look at indentured servitude, the people who are indentured servants have a choice to some extent, right? They have a contract. They also, their servitude in New Netherlands, if I remember correctly, and it's been a while since I read this, but I think it's around 4 to 5 years of indentured servitude before they would be free. So for enslaved Africans, they had no choice, right? They were taken from their homelands violently. They had no contract. They were able to obtain their freedom in some cases, but in many of those cases, they had been enslaved for at least 18 years. So, and even in those cases, like the most famous is a group of men who obtained their freedom in 1644 with their wives, 11 men with their wives. Their children, according to the council, including those who are to be born, will in fact still remain in bondage. So, no indentured servant that's not a status that is hereditary, right? So that's another really important distinction. So to say that they are more like servants or indentured servants, I would absolutely disagree with that.
Okay.
Good. Couple points there, if I can.
Yeah.
It's curious that towards the end of slavery in New York, you do get quite a number of slaves whose status gets converted into something like indentured servitude, where they sign on for agreements for 5 or 10 years. Now I'm talking, this is particularly in like the 1810s. It happens a little bit before that, but as emancipation is approaching, the slave owners are trying to maximize the output of their slaves. And they're fearing that these people are going to run away, or they're going to be free in 15 years anyway. So why not sign an agreement with them that says, if you work really hard for 5 years, I'll give you your freedom early, right? So then they can maximize and guarantee this labor. The other curious thing is that in the 19th century, a lot of these memoirs of slavery in New York, especially the Dutch, they like to talk about my dear grandfather and his loyal Black servants. Right? These were not servants. I mean, these were slaves. In almost every case, when the memory says servants, they're just trying to diminish the word escapes me, diminish the awfulness of the situation that a lot of these people were in.
Yeah, just to add, I mean, that was the same in the South, right? Like here in Louisiana, any plantation museum you would go to, it's changing now, but they would always refer to the enslaved people as servants. So yeah.
I was going to add to that if you, it may not be the case now, but the last time I went to Monticello, the docents kept referring to the slaves as servants. And of course, we were a group of historians and we knew better, but it sounds better to say servants, but of course, Jefferson had slaves.
Yeah. The question, will the panelists also be speaking to the history of Dutch profiting from their involvement in the transatlantic slave trade? While I understand the focus here is on New York, it seems important to note how much the Netherlands was involved in the slave trade to the English and Spanish American colonies. Would anyone like to comment on that?
I can, if I'm actually working on a book. My next book will be about the Dutch slave ship, the Gideon, and the shift in the 1660s. I think it's an important decade in really increasing the transatlantic slave trade and kind of setting up the infrastructure for that. And the Dutch are very important in that, and in part because they are at that point they actually have a contract with the Genoese merchants who at that point hold the asiento, which is the monopoly to actually provide and save people to the Spanish colonies. So the Dutch at that particular point, and you can see that Curacao becomes increasingly a slave depot where enslaved Africans are being brought and then being sold and distributed across the Americas. That's what happens with a lot of the ships that go to New Netherland in the 1660s. But also a lot of the enslaved people that end up in the Spanish colonies. And eventually the Dutch actually hold the asiento in various forms and various people. So absolutely. And actually, if we look at North America, we also see that the very first ship to have brought
There you go.
Africans in 1619 was a Dutch ship, right? We see the two largest numbers of enslaved people brought into North America in the 17th century up until 1670 are Dutch ships. So yes, they were very prominent, and a lot of the slave trade also in North America came through Dutch colonies via the Dutch. So yes, it's very important.
Someone just added a note to Margaret's point. I was at Monticello in February 2020, and they were not called servants then, I guess. They were clear on the iniquities and status of the enslaved people held there. So maybe that's an update. Question, are there any 18th century visual depictions of Dutch slavery in New Netherlands? Well, I guess they mean in the 18th century in New York. Any resources in the Netherlands?
There's a book called Blacks in the Dutch World. I can't remember. I used to have it.
Allison Blakely.
Excuse me? Yes.
Allison Blakely.
Yes. Some wonderful paintings and etchings in there. And then also there's a book entitled An Embarrassment of Riches. Professor at Columbia, and he has in his book some excellent artwork on Blacks and Dutchmen working.
It's Simon Schama's book.
Shaman, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, a question. With the American Revolution 250th, Erie Canal bicentennial, and the 1827 bicentennial, how do we get this information into the remembrances? Talking about public history here, how to make it part of the landscape.
Well, you know, it depends on whose hands the Erie Canal commemoration is in. They were very prejudiced against the Dutch in terms of setting up the canal. I mean, I was working on Sojourner Truth. I was amazed at the kind of comments in the newspapers looking for workers to work on the canal. And there would be comments like, Dutchmen need not apply unless they are pretty well Yankeefied. So it's very interesting. And this is 1822, 23, and especially 1827. And this is the same year that the emancipation of adults in New York takes place. But it was interesting to me that prejudice was still there. So however they handle it, I have no idea.
This is someone named Madeline van Leer, L-I-E-R, is asking, how would I go about finding if the van Leers owned slaves? So we could broaden that to how does anyone find if their family owns slaves?
I have no idea.
Well, I can contribute a few things on this. First, let me say that the curator at the Brooklyn Museum, I forget what it's called, and I forget his name. I can look it up later and tell you, has recently just published a booklet of 100 and so pages. And there's lots of paintings on slaves in New York in the 18th century. So those are probably the best depictions. As far as whether your ancestor had a slave, so I have created a quite large database now on slave sales in New York. including the name of the slave, the age, the person who sold them, the person who received the slaves, where they were sold, and the price. And I've done this so that I can chart slave prices over time to say whether they've gone up or down. Anyway, in that I have, I think it's close to 2,000 sales now. And so that's gonna include only a very small percent of the slave owners in New York. But I could very easily type in a name like Van Leer and see if it comes up, if they were ever sold in that. I think there is some census, I forget which one, that says whether the families had slaves. So if you look at the 1790 census, for example, and look under the family names for New York, you'll be able to see whether they're listed, but you won't get the slaves' names or anything else like that.
Can I add something? John Jay College in New York actually has a database that you can search. You can look for it online, and I'm not sure what the name of it is, but if you look for slavery, John Jay College, or slave owners, John Jay College, I know it will come up. And if you have trouble finding it, you can always email me and I'd be happy to send it to you. It's not, perfect, but it has a lot of that information. So that might be a resource to actually start looking by putting in that last name. I also know that, and I'm sure, it's the same with Michael. I have a lot of the records transcribed on my computer. Sometimes I get emails from people who ask me these questions, and it honestly is just like 2 minutes for me to do a search of my computer for a name. And if nothing comes up, I'll let you know. If something comes up, I will let you know. So, and I'm sure there's other historians who are working on this topic, who've gone through these records, who would be similarly, happy. So easy these days, right? With word processor, you could just search it and it'll come up. But I would start with going to that database or the database that Michael is creating. I don't know if that becomes available at some point, but Jay College is live online. You can use it right now. So.
Right, I think we're past time. There are other comments and questions. I'll just note one here. I see Ronnie Baer, whom I know, who's a great art historian at Princeton, apropos of the question about images of slavery, points out that there's an exhibit now at the Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam on slavery, and there are lots of images there, including online, that you can look up. Thank you all. This has been a wonderful discussion, lively. I've got so many questions I didn't even begin to ask. Willemijn and Damien, can I turn it over to you?
Absolutely. Thank you so very much, Russell, for your time and your thoughtful leading of the discussion. And thank you, Professors Delma, Masterman, and Washington, for joining us today. This has been a fascinating and really important conversation. So thank you. I wish that we had another hour. I would love to be able to answer all the questions that come in. I have tons of questions as well, but I cannot thank you enough for participating in today. For those of you who have watched, we will be putting the webinar online on the Vimeo channel of the NUF, and I know that RIAS will put it on the YouTube channel of the RIAS website as well. So if you want to listen back or share this with your friends, it will be made available shortly.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you all.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.